Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank the European University of St. Petersburg and the Centre d'études franco-russe for inviting me to this conference. And the paper I'm delivering deals with the reception of American narratives on the Second World War in post-war Italy, approximately from 1945 to 1968. More specifically, it focuses on the reception of Hollywood movies about the conflict, which represent by far the most widespread means of diffusion of such narratives. The paper will be divided into two parts. The first one will highlight the main aspects of the image of World War II offered by American movies imported to Italy, as well as on the role played by such movies in US propaganda. The second part will investigate their reception through a variety of sources: film reviews, magazines and tabloids, polls, interviews, and sociological inquiries. So, starting from the first part, it must be said that the Second World War has been a favorite subject for American cinema since the very beginning of the conflict itself. From 1940 to the present, Hollywood studios have released hundreds of movies dealing with what has sometimes been called the Good War or America's finest hour. Although mainly shot from a US perspective, many of these movies were not exclusively addressed to a domestic audience. Especially from the mid-50s on, Western European audience seems to have been a primary target for Hollywood war movies. Consequently, plots and scenes were conceived not to disappoint Italian, French, and even German spectators. Western German, obviously. As an example, the Italian version of A Walk in the Sun by Lewis Milestone, 1945, a movie released in 1946, which is set during the Salerno landing in Italy, underwent the strategic cutting of a scene where American soldiers met a not-so-glorious fascist officer. Later, in The Young Lions by Dmitri in 1958, Marlon Brando played a German officer who, as the war became more and more cruel, gradually turned against the Nazi regime. As an Italian reviewer underlined, it was a deep change from the original plot of the novel from which the movie was inspired, which, on the contrary, showed the progressive dehumanization of the character, a change that was probably due to the need to sell the movie in Germany, a close US ally and a key market for Hollywood's products. The strategy worked well. Some war movies became real blockbusters and sold millions of tickets in Italy. To give some example, and here are many examples in the chart, just to give some, to underline some of them, in 1954 and 55, From Here to Eternity by Zinnemann in 1950, published in 1954, ranked second among the most viewed movies in the 16 main Italian cities. And The Cane Mutiny ranked sixth. In 1958, The Young Lions was the fourth. And in the first years of staging, The Guns of Navarone, here we are, okay, sold only in the first year. Here in the chart, we have the sum of all the years of staging. But in the first year, The Guns of Navarone sold more than 5 million tickets, and The Great Escape, more than 3 million. So such an undeniable box office success is a good reason itself to investigate a movie's impact on Italian representations of the war. But there is more. As cinema historians pointed out, the overwhelming majority of World War II movies offered a very similar and quite stereotypical, here we are, representation of the conflict, thus producing a cumulative effect that is likely to have strengthened their influence on the audience. In fact, Janine Basinger explicitly declared that the very war movie genre was born with World War II films, and even a rough survey confirms that assumption. In the overwhelming majority of American movies of the Second World War, we can find stereotypical characters, similar situations, a shared ideological perspective, and many stylistic similarities. A detailed analysis of such features is impossible here. What's important to underline is that they all contribute to the creation of an image of the war as a good one, maybe a cruel, violent, unfair war, but a right one, one that is worth fighting. And this is by all means the most important aspect of American movies on the Second World conflict. It can be clearly declared or simply suggested. It can be softened with many nuances or cried out loudly, but at the end, it's always good against evil. The absurdity, the senselessness, the atrocity which characterize many movies on the First World War or on the Vietnam War are absent or secondary in World War II films. Obviously, The Western allies stand on the right side, Germany and Japan on the wrong one. Russians often don't even appear, like Italians, in fact. The propagandistic effect of such a representation is hard to deny, but it's not the only meaningful element of the movies, nor perhaps it's the most important. In fact, World War II doesn't seem to have been a main theme in US propaganda. Among the films whose export got support from the ECA authorities, there wasn't a single war movie. And a quick glance at the materials produced by the United States Information Agency, the USIS Information Service, after 1945 confirmed such hypothesis. USIS released hundreds of films, newsreels, and documentaries in Italian in the post-war decades, and none of them directly dealt with the Second World War. They celebrated the USA in almost any possible way, showing American democracy in action, underlining freedom and wealth, offering sparkling pictures of modern life in New York City. But they never reminded their audience of the role played by the United States in the war. That can hardly be considered a coincidence. All the more since a similar omission can be detected in the press, in the US press in Italy. To make just an example, from 1954 to 1956, USIS published a propaganda magazine, Mondo Occidentale, which didn't contain a single article about the war. The absence is something worth noticing. Even though these examples don't represent a complete survey of American propaganda sources, not even on those addressed to Italy. Things could be different in other geopolitical contexts, such as Asia or Eastern Europe. And even in Italy, USIS libraries did propose to the public some books about the US role in the war, but no more than a few. Generally speaking, and in a context limited to Italy, it can be said that soon after the end of the Second World War and during the Cold War years, US participation in the conflict was no longer considered an effective propaganda theme. Such a conclusion must be taken into account when analyzing the reception of American war movies in Italy for two connected reasons. On the one hand, the lack of interest shown by the US propaganda machine for the Second World War means that Hollywood war movies can hardly be considered as part of a deliberate international operation. If there was any over-propagandistic intervention in their creation, it was for domestic and not for foreign purposes, such as the support that many movies received from the US Army. Makes an example, The Halls of Montezuma, The Caine Mutiny, or The St. The Longest Day. On the other hand, it also means that the same films didn't have to interact with a well-established and strongly supported US official representation of the war, which made them the main vehicle for spreading American narratives, war narratives in Italy. To sum up, Hollywood movies dealing with the Second World War were less a product of Cold War propaganda than the reflection of a US national myth, a reflection which, like many myths in the age of mass media, was also a creation. Such myth, which can be synthetically labeled as the myth of the good war, seems to have easily entered the Italian imaginary, probably because of its mainly authentic and unintentional features. Authentic between inverted commas. However, the way it did so is quite a complex issue, as it involves a phenomenon, or more precisely, a set of phenomena that are very hard to detect and analyze: the reception of foreign cultural products by the national audience, the Italian audience in this case. In order to investigate it, we must look at many different sources, each one shedding light on a different aspect. And this is the theme of the second part of the paper. We can divide the available sources into three main groups: those providing an insight into the attitudes of the cultural elite, those helping us to define the use that the opinion makers made of American narratives, and those reflecting the way those narratives were interpreted by common people or by general audience. The first group is mainly composed of cinema magazines, especially those realized by and addressed to film critics. Generally speaking, magazines of this kind don't show a great consideration for American movies on the Second World War, which are usually given quite a negative evaluation. Since the early post-war years, critics recognize the features of the war movie genre, especially the most stereotypical and rhetoric ones. No later than 1950, John Ford's film They Were Expendable is criticized because of all the military junk, I'm quoting, it contains. For many experts, Hollywood war movies are essentially rhetorical, cold and soundless. If they appreciate one of them, usually they explain that it's because it contains some elements that fall outside the genre, which is to say, because it's not just a war movie. Such an attitude prevents the critics from recognizing the effectiveness of stereotypical features in creating a shared, uncontroversial, and reassuring image of the war. To make an example, A Walk in the Sun is appraised because the soldiers it portrays are, and I'm quoting, authentic fighters who don't like war, but are forced to make it. They are, I'm quoting again, authentic men with real feelings, passions, behaviors. The judgment is probably true, but it doesn't recognize that the very central element of the plot, the story of a small platoon made up of very different characters, all involved into the tragedy of the war, is one of the most typical elements of the war movie genre, and one of the most typical elements of the American ideology of the great nation born from differences. In this case, as in many others, war movies are identified with their bombastic, emphatic, rhetoric tones and reduced to them. The result is the dismissal of the genre itself. Such a dismissal transcends ideological and chronological cleavages, as it is shared by both left-wing and conservative critics, and it remains unvaried until at least the late 60s. As it's based on clear aesthetic and artistic criteria, it turns into a common evaluation standard, a collective awareness which is shared by the majority of the intellectual community, what we would call a common taste. As any cultural standards, it tends to be only partially explicit. It orientates perception and judgments, and it contributes to the definition of a collective identity which distinguishes the insiders from the outsiders. In this case, cultured spectators from ordinary audience. The most apparent historical consequence of this phenomenon is the lesser attention paid to the impact that American war movies had on Italian mass audience. An example will help clarifying the issue. In January 1946, a magazine called La Critica Cinematografica published an article named The Freedom of Being Heroes, here we are, which compared the coldness previously showed by Italian people towards fascist propaganda films with the enthusiasm that the same audience demonstrated for Hollywood war movies. According to the author, such a different attitude depended on the fact that American propaganda supported a right cause, which is a very interesting suggestion. But the most interesting thing is that this is the only article that tried to analyze and explain the success of American war movies among Italian audience. As far as I know, in the following years, nobody even asked a similar question. The simple fact that war movies were often blockbusters was basically ignored. And this is quite a clear demonstration of the existence of two different cultural discourses. In fact, elite magazines were not addressed to a wide audience. Popular magazines and newspapers were. They are the second group of sources mentioned above. As they are explicitly devoted to orientate public opinion, they have quite a different attitude towards American war movies. On one hand, they take them into much more consideration than what specialized magazines do. On the other hand, they show a greater variety of attitudes depending on their political allegiance and on the period we consider. The first Cold War years are characterized by a hard ideological fight, clearly detectable in film reviews. Communist and anti-communist critics tend to adopt opposite attitudes towards American war movies, the former always criticizing them as militarist and propagandistic, the latter praising the Allies as the liberators of Europe and the American soldiers as heroes. Let's take the movie Battleground, released in Italy in 1950. That describes the resistance of a group of American soldiers to the German counterattack in the Ardennes in 1944, in winter 1944. L'Unità, the communist official newspaper, accuses it of, I'm quoting, turning the war into a sport match, thus supporting militarism and the merchants of guns. Moreover, the Daily charges the movie with historical faults because it doesn't show the role of USSR in detracting German forces from the West Front, thus helping the Allies. On the other side, La Stampa, one of the most important independent and strongly anti-communist newspapers, described Battleground as maybe the most convincing war movie among the many that America produced in the last years, precisely because it's a non-rhetoric, realistic film which describes the tragedy of the war, I'm quoting, and shows a group of soldiers that perform their duty, even if they don't trust propaganda. Such a hostility toward any description of the war which underestimates its tragic aspects is a common element in film reviews in the 50s. Curiously, it is shared by both ideological fields. La Stampa normally accepts American representations of the conflict. For instance, the heroic resistance of battleground, which I described before, is defined a decisive episode of the war. But when propaganda ends up to hide the tragedy of the conflict, then it is considered, I'm quoting, really excessive. A similar attitude is obviously shared by communists and left-wing critics. But it is also shared by the Catholics, whose official magazine, La Rivista del Cinematografo, criticizes the wartime movie Crash Dive as an example of military propaganda and appreciates instead the story of G.I. Joe as a valid accusation of the war. We'll come back to this. For now, it's important to underline that both aspects, the ideological approach to war movies and the annoyance towards any softened representation of the conflict, seem to fade away by the end of the 50s. In 1962, The Longest Day, the all-star blockbuster about the Normandy landing, comes to Italy. Both La Stampa and L'Unità recognize that it's the sum of all war movies cliché, but they don't seem to care, and they both praise the technical quality and even the documentary value of the film. The same could be said about other blockbusters like The Guns of Navarone or The Battle of the Bulge. Apparently, in the 60s, militarist rhetoric doesn't provoke the harsh rejection it caused in earlier years, and ideological differences are far less important than before. It's a significant shift, which is not shared by specialized reviews that keep on criticizing war movies, but which find some correspondence in the audience's attitude. At least, this is what we can hypothesize on the basis of the few sources available, which represent the third group of sources identified above. So the sources for the investigation of the reception of American war movies among mass audience are by far the least numerous and the most fragmentary. On the one hand, there are quantitative sources, selling data above all, and some polls realized by Italian institutes and American agencies. On the other hand, we have qualitative sources, which are very rare and always refer to very small segments of the population. Quantitative sources provide useful indications about the number of Italian people who came in contact with American movies. Few box office data is available for the first post-war years, but since 1954, we can extract much more exhaustive series from the bulletins of the Italian Authors and Publishers Society, Società Italiana Autori Editori. As we have already seen, many US war movies were real blockbusters and kept on being staged for years. Nevertheless, quantitative data can tell us anything about the impression that these movies raised among the audience. In order to investigate this aspect, we have very few sources available. The most famous one is perhaps a sociological inquiry realized in the second half of the 50s in Scarperia, a mountain village in central Italy. The study, which focuses on the attitude of the local population towards cinema, shows us an interesting difference between older and younger people. While only 1/5 of the former consider war movies as his favorite genre, the percentage raised up to 42% among the latter. Along with the author, the only meaningful difference we can detect between the first group and the others is that the first class was composed by people who had between 6 and 10 years during the war, and whose memories of the conflict were thus less clear and vivid. This could be taken with all the required cautions as a confirmation that the 50s have been characterized by opposite or at least different patterns of reception. The last source I'm considering here, besides, seems to confirm that such an opposition faded in the 60s. It's a series of interviews realized between 1962 and 1966 by the Centro Culturale San Fedele, Cultural Center San Fedele, a Catholic cultural institution in Milan, within the audience of its own theater. It's a very interesting source, as it provides us not only with the opinions of tens of spectators about many films, among which there are 5 Hollywood movies about the war, but also with the age, gender, and job of each of them. It's impossible to summarize here all the information that can be obtained from an in-depth analysis of the 175 reviews produced by the spectators. about the 5 war movies which were staged in the theater. What can be highlighted is that the majority of the audience, which was mainly composed of upper and middle class members, basically share the ideology of the movies. Even when they recognize the rhetorical and propagandistic aspects of the films, they generally approve the values they conveyed. More specifically, it was the idea of the good war, of the war for freedom and justice, which appeared to be the most noticed and the most praised element of the movies. In conclusion, some consideration about the reception of American war movies in Italy can be done. First of all, quite a clear separation can be detected between the cultural elite, popular press, and mass audience. While the critics keep on showing disapproval and little interest toward war movies, the public discourse seems to change by the end of the 50s, as well as the audience's attitudes. More specifically, the idea of the horrendousness of the Second World War seems to become a shared value and a common representation of the conflict. Such idea, which is the core of the US myth of the war, fosters the acceptance of many other elements of the American narratives. For example, the overwhelming majority of the audience of the Centro Culturale San Fedele believes that the Normandy landing was the turning point of the conflict, which is a typical Western center assumption. But why was the idea of the good war easily accepted? I think it's because it easily matches with national representations, like the partisan fight against the German invader. And above all, it tends to confirm the social, political, and international order Italy is inserted in. The convergence of communist and non-communist evaluations described above is a very meaningful hint. Communists cannot completely refuse the idea of the good war, because the fight against fascism is their main source of legitimacy, both at an international and at a local level. Had American narratives directly opposed local narratives, they would probably have been refused, as the negative reaction raised by the underestimation of the tragic aspects of the conflict shows. But they didn't. And as time passed by, direct memories tended to fade, while the power of Hollywood myths got stronger and stronger. Thus, while interacting and intertwining with Italian representations of the war, American narratives progressively introduced their peculiar perspective into the national public discourse. To make one last example, the distinction between Germans and Nazis, which is a recurring theme of American movies, seems to be widely shared by the audience of the Centro Culturale San Fedele. To conclude, I'd like to underline the importance of focusing on a transnational, if not a global scale, when studying cultural phenomena in a global world. In a highly interconnected context, such as the post-1945 world, the spreading of myths and narratives was not limited by national boundaries, but constantly overcome them. And I think that the case of the American myth of the good war is a clear example of the power and of the influence of such diffusion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So do we have any questions from audience here or from audience online? Please, as usual, you can type your question in chat or just let us know that you would like to ask questions loudly. Is it a question?
It's a question, yes.
Wow, we have a question.
Hello, Danielle, thank you very much.
Could you...
I've got a loud voice. I just wanted to ask how you felt about a film like Bridge Over the River Kwai, which isn't so much about the war as about a Frenchman's reaction to the way that different nationalities manifested their characters during the war, as compared with a film like Patton, which is a, you know, guns and blood. And did you make any differentiation between these films, which I think they're kind of an extreme, really?
Yeah. Well, in fact, The Bridge on the River Kwai is an Anglo-American movie. It's not
written by a Frenchman. Written by a Frenchman.
Yeah, it's by David Lean, right?
Pierre Boulle was the book.
The book. Okay, but the movie is by David Lean, I think.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Now, I haven't studied the books and their connection with the movies and the translation of the plots from the books to the movies. I'm still working on it. So I just answer about the movie, which was in fact a colossal and a blockbuster too, and it showed and you're right in stating that it showed quite a different description of the war. It deals with war prisoners and the conflict, the confrontation between different cultures, the Japanese and the British prisoners' conception of war, military honor, and American conception of military honor. Yes, there are some movies which do not perfectly fit into the stereotype, the genre, and the Bridge on the River Kwai is one of them, but I think it's not casual that it's not an American movie, a completely American movie. I mean, European narratives are quite more complex and quite different from the US narratives. Okay, I think that the reception of the movie was I was thinking about any peculiarity in the reaction, but there wasn't. Surely it was appreciated because of its complexity. It was appreciated by the critics too, okay? While Patton wasn't. Sure. But I think that this confirmed my interpretation. I mean, if a movie was a bit slightly different, things changed, but it was more an exception than another standard.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Is there any questions here or there? I would like to ask a question, maybe a little bit out of topic, but yes. Could you please point out, were there any differences in terms of features of American movies and Italian movies on this topic? Were there any differences in main character representation, or we are talking about American movies, were Italian movies more or less the same type or totally different type during this time?
Okay, well, I'm not a cinema historian, I'm just an historian, so don't take my words as an exhaustive answer, but I think there were. First of all, Italian movies were dealt mainly with the resistance and the occupation. So they were not just war movies, but were, well, we can call them resistance movies, okay? Civil war movies, okay? The issue was much more complicated then. The issues at stake were much more complicated, and that's everything changed. But also in the main characters, for example, there are some differences. For example, one of the typical American stereotype is the platoon. The small platoon of soldiers composed by many different by a representative of each social group involved in the war, or that would like to represent the American army as a microcosm for the American society, all fighting for the right cause. This aspect there isn't in Italian movies. Normally there are more complex characters. There are fights inside the groups, not the platoons, inside the partisans group. For example, there is often a traitor, which is a character seldom existent in American movies, because the traitor is one of the main characters in a civil war movie, I'd say. And there are many more differences of this kind, I would say, because because the resistance is also a myth in Italy, was different. The memories were much more, were stronger and much more harder to deal with. And so even the movies were quite different, I'd say. I hope I answered.
Yep.
Thanks.
And we have one more question from our audience, from Semyon Dinshits. I know that The Ballad of a Soldier by Chukhrai got David Di Donatello Award. And do you know what was the reception of Soviet war films in comparison with American one?
Okay, here again, I must say that I didn't study in depth the the Soviet myth, because there was also a Soviet myth in the, I didn't say Soviet because it was mainly spread by the Communist Party. But there is quite a radical shift well, there is the same shift that there is in the American representation of the role played by the USSR in the war. Until 1947, even American movies showed, gave us a good, positive representation of the Russian participation to the war. I think that it's a, I don't remember the title, but there are a couple of American movies showing the resistance of the glorious Russian people to the invasion, to the onrush of German armies, which obviously radically changed after 1947, after the beginning of the Cold War. And the Americans did not represent Russians in a negative way. They simply did not represent them in the movies. And so happened in Italy. That the widespread representation of the conflict was almost completely Western centered, because it was built up mainly on the American movies and on Western narratives. There are also British narratives, but which I didn't deal with, but which are also important. But there is another aspect. Soviet movies were widely appreciated by Italian intellectuals, while American movies were not, and especially movies about the revolution, like the Piotrowski battleship. I don't know the English title for it. In Italy, it's Corazzata Piotrowski. I'm sorry. And anyway, movies by like October by Eisenstein and so on were really appreciated by the critics, and were obviously supported by the communist press and the communist organizations, and were staged in movie group, in the I don't know the English for it, the groups watching movies, private groups watching movies, okay, which were a significant form of building up a cinema culture in the 50s and the 60s, but a culture which was limited to a restricted number of people. No more than 20,000 people took part to these groups, which mainly adopted a strongly left-wing attitude. So on the left-wing part of Italian public opinion, and among the intellectuals, which were mostly left-wing oriented, Soviet movies were really appreciated, and obviously American weren't. But on the other side, I think there were no Soviet movies about the war which reached a success similar to the American movies.